Good evening, I'm Jim Zirin. This is the Digital Age. Tonight's show is about the Gilded Age in America, from 1870 to 1893. The Gilded Age was a period of fabulous characters, such as Lillian Russell, Diamond Jim Brady, and Bette Million Gates. It was also a period of tremendous political discord. Government was dysfunctional. There was bitter partisanship in Congress over issues like international trade, monetary policy, and involvement in foreign wars, some of the very issues that vex us today. And presiding over all the discord was the Speaker of the House of Representatives, three-term Speaker Thomas B. Reid, a Republican of Maine. Reid broke the logjam with Reid's rules, which significantly govern the way our laws are made today. Reid is the subject of a brilliant new biography, although he was almost forgotten in history. The biography is entitled Mr. Speaker, The Life and Times of Thomas B. Reid, the man who broke the filibuster, and the author of the book is James Grant of the Interest Rate Observer, Grant's Interest Rate Observer.
And Brooklyn Heights.
And who also lives in Brooklyn Heights. And we are delighted to have him with us today. Jim Grant, welcome.
Thank you. It is a pleasure.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you with us. Now, let's start with, well, congratulations on your book, of course.
Thank you.
But let's start with the Gilded Age.
Yes.
Gilded Age was a term coined by Mark Twain.
Right.
He could have said the Golden Age, but he said the Gilded Age. Right. Why did he say the Gilded Age, and why did that typify the period?
He was a writer. I bet he went through 2 or 3 drafts until he settled on the Gilded Age. I think it sounds better.
Right. You need drafts for something like that.
Yes, you do.
Well, I mean,
I myself am not much until the 15th.
Well, it's a delightful commentary on the period. I mean, it's much like Oscar Levant's saying of Hollywood, beneath the tinsel is real tinsel. but what fascinated you about the Gilded Age? And
well, it is ever so different than our own time, but very much alike. For example, then people debated the role of the dollar. What was the dollar, they asked, fundamentally. And some of them said, why the dollar? The dollar is a unit of currency defined in the Constitution as a particular weight of metal. I said, you could look it up. Look it up. Look what Alexander Hamilton said. That was one side of the argument. The other side of the argument was, hey, you can print these things, and you can print enough of them so that we'll all be rather rich. Let's do that. That was the other side of the debate.
Sounds like Ben Bernanke.
It does. So you can see the attraction. My day job is writing about financial markets, and so I came across Reid in a chapter of Barbara Tuchman's terrific book called Proud Tower. It was a collection of profiles on political people, mainly, who lived during the 1890s through the turn of the 20th century into the 1900s. And Reid was the subject of one of these chapters, and he was a delightful character in that chapter. And I was looking for a biographical topic, and I made inquiries to Bowdoin College, where Reid went to study when he was a kid. And lo and behold, there were his papers, and the professors hadn't touched them for about 50 years. So the way was all clear.
So you blew the dust off the papers and went to work.
Yes.
How long did your research take?
Well, you know, when you write, you research as long as possible, that being so much more agreeable than the actual typing. I guess all told, the thing took 4 years. I had some terrific research help with a guy named Adam Rowe, who's a rising historian in his own right. But the papers were there, and we had a benefactor and a previous researcher who had spent years doing this stuff. His name was Mr. Gallagher, and then decided not, after all, to write the book. So thank you, Mr. Gallagher. And thank you, Adam Rowe.
You've just run your credits.
Yeah.
Now, as I said, Reid has all been overlooked in history. There's no legislation that comes to mind that bears his name, like the Sherman Antitrust Act of the period. There is no office building in Congress named for Reid, although we have office buildings named for Rayburn and Longworth and Cannon.
All true, James. All true.
How come he's buried in the dustbin before you resurrected him?
It's a deplorable state of affairs. You're quite right. No major legislation. He wasn't so keen on a lot of legislation. I don't think he would have minded so much not being named for one. He was in Congress mostly in opposition. And then when he was not in opposition, he was the Speaker. The Speakers don't generally initiate bills, they preside over the workings of the House. His contribution in politics was mainly in the somewhat obscure field of parliamentary tactics. He was a brilliant parliamentarian. He knew how to work the machinery of the House, how to make motions, how to thwart motions. You mentioned in your very nice opening talk that there was discord in Congress during those years. Reid was not only a witness to it, he helped to create it. He was a source of it. Bitter partisan wrangling, which, by the way, is another feature of that day that may resonate with our own. The Democrats didn't seem to mind. Democrats then were the party of liberty, of what we would call today libertarianism. They believed in the individual as opposed to the state. They deplored the intervention of government into the daily life of the American people.
And they were the penny pinchers.
They were the penny pinchers.
Boy, what a switch.
They threw around nickels like manhole covers, as someone said. They deplored the government, basically, and they were happy to have it thwarted.
Now, the Republicans?
Republicans were kind of the George W. Bush Republicans. They were the patriots. They were the believers in the American enterprise and, say, in a collective American enterprise, and they believed not in an overbearing government, but in a rather muscular one. And on those terms, the two parties were at daggers drawn for so many years.
And Reid's prominent political colleagues and friends were people like William McKinley, who he defeated for Speaker, who later became president, Teddy Roosevelt,
yes.
Henry Cabot Lodge.
Well, Teddy Roosevelt.
Icons of politics in
right.
America.
We remember all those names except until recently, Reid's. Teddy Roosevelt worshipped Reid. He looked up to him as a mentor and more. Reid was some years older. Reid was also a very successful and fluid and productive writer. He wrote for pay, as did Roosevelt. Roosevelt wrote books for money, very fast, and he admired Reid's writing style. Right? Reid was an essayist. I think his attention span was a little too short for a book. Reid admired as well. Roosevelt admired as well Reid's success in politics. He was returned to office over and over from his district in Portland, Maine. And he admired, most of all, did this earnest fellow Roosevelt. He admired Reid's wit. Reid said once of the earnest and deadly serious Roosevelt, he said, Theodore, one of the things I admire in you most is your original discovery of the Ten Commandments.
Well, that's perfect. Now, Reid was present at the time of a parliamentary quirk called the disappearing quorum. This was in the post-Civil War period. The Republicans were in the majority, although they enjoyed a narrow majority in the House. And when the Democrats wanted to block legislation, they simply refused to answer the roll call.
Yes, well, in that day, the Constitution specifies that to do business, the House must have a quorum. A quorum is not defined, I believe, in the Constitution. People took it to mean a majority of the people who were in Congress must be present and voting. The rub was the and voting part. Say you were present, but you chose to sit in your hands or to button your lips come the roll call. You were there in physically, but you were not there vocally. Now, was that a part of the quorum? Well, it had been decided over many Congresses that people who were there but who chose not to acknowledge their presence through answering the roll call, those people were actually not there. So merely by
they were not counted for quorum purposes.
Right. Merely by biting your tongue, you could, or a group of people could thwart the Congress by denying the Speaker a quorum, therefore denying him the opportunity to act on legislation. And unless the majority party had a clear majority such that the usual number of people who were out sick, who were visiting relatives, who were back in their districts politicking, the clear majority enough so that they could pass a bill with a clear majority. I'm not saying this very well. If the majority,
it's quite clear to me. The Democrats were being obstructive.
Right, and the Republicans, in their turn, when they were in the minority, they would sit mum during the roll calls, and until the Democrats came around and were prepared to be reasonable, to compromise. So it was that Congress after Congress didn't do very much except talk and take the roll call and adjourn.
So what did Mr. Speaker do about that?
Well, Reid, first of all, let me set the scene. Reid was a great believer, an observer, and admirer of material progress in the last quarter of the 19th century. He was an optimist. He got up in the morning believing that the American people, the American economy, was on its way to wonderful things. He believed that the 19th century would lead into a period of even greater material advance, not just the telegraph and the telephone and steam power and bank credit, but things you could hardly imagine. He would dine, for example, with Alexander Graham Bell, and Bell would tell him about this coming medium that, as Reid described in his diary, was a lot like television. You could be in Washington and yet see someone in New York. Reid believed these things would happen, and he was properly in awe of the geniuses who were bringing them to pass. Okay, that was what Reid saw happening all around him.
Now, what would he have said about the internet?
He would have been thunderstruck, but he would not have been disbelieving. He would have been amazed, but he was, yes, that would have
been a Facebook
that
friend.
would have happened, yeah. Okay, that was what he saw in the world. What he saw in his daily life was the opposite of progress. It was this maddening molasses of parliamentary wrangling that resulted in nothing, that resulted in talking, adjournment, parliamentary posturing, political posturing, but no constructive legislation. Reid believed in some constructive legislation. He wanted a proper Library of Congress building. He wanted...
That costs money.
Cost money. He wanted the government to enforce international copyright protection for authors. He wanted all sorts of things that we now, most of us, some of us, take for granted. It was not to be because of the very organization of Congress. So Reid set out to bring Congress into the late 19th century.
And for this, he was called Czar Reid.
He was called Czar Reid. He was reviled by the Democrats because one day he got up and the scene was the following. It was, I've forgotten what year it was. 25 years ago, I remember it like this. But it was in the early 1890s. Reid was Speaker. And the Republicans had a narrow majority, but not so great a majority as to guarantee them the ability to thwart a Democratic filibuster or disappearing quorum. And there was controversy over a particular congressman. Should he be seated? There was a claim of fraud. There was a vote to be held. So roll call. And naturally, the Democrats, not wanting to help Republicans move on with this project, sat mum. Wouldn't say nothing. No acknowledgement. Reid began to call out the names of the silent Democrats as present. He answered for them.
Heresy.
Heresy. A revolution. Usurper. The Democrats were beside themselves. They were enraged. There was a scene of quite near. It was very much on the verge of violence. So don't forget Congress. This was a Congress filled with veterans of the Civil War. These are people. These were practiced killers in uniform.
Didn't they take guns onto the floor of the House of Representatives?
That was before the Civil War. One of Reid's congressional colleagues remembered the day when someone's firearm accidentally discharged in his desk, and you looked around and everyone was standing up with his own pistol. The guy said,
ready to do battle.
It looked more like a Texas bar room than the Congress of the United States. Anyway, the people in Congress, the guys in Congress then knew a little bit about shooting and killing and violence, and they were prepared, some of them, to take it to Reid physically. So Reid persisted in calling out the names of the present but silent Democrats, and as he did so, rage rose. Shouting louder, threats more plausible. And Reid, as if this weren't enough to enrage the Democrats, the now disenfranchised Democrats, Reid sat there absolutely imperturbable. He was like a sphinx up in the speaker's chair. He would not give them the satisfaction of showing any emotion. And this went on for 2 or 3 days until finally the Democrats had to yield. And lo and behold, the Reid rule came to be enshrined, and no more was and later it was formally instituted that no more you could deny the Congress a quorum simply through withholding your name in a roll call.
And he ungummed the government.
He ungummed the government, for better or for worse.
Well, we could argue that one another time. But let's look for a moment at Reid's values. First place, he was a very fine speaker with a small s, was he not? He made some brilliant speeches on the floor.
He was. Every once in a while, he would compose a stemwinder, a speech of 45 minutes to an hour. And at the not so...
Which he'd memorize.
Yeah, he would memorize it. Sometimes he'd have an aide standing by with cue cards, but he wouldn't refer to them. He would commit these things to memory. He had a prodigious memory as a college student at Bowdoin, and he didn't lose it. He retired. You know, he was active until his late 50s, early 60s, and I don't know about you, Jim, but I'm not sure I could memorize an hour's worth of rhetoric on the tariff.
I certainly couldn't.
Yeah, so that was, and Reid was...
The tariff is one of the burning issues.
It was, but Reid was, he was fine at these set pieces. Much more to his taste was the cut and thrust of the running debate and the brilliant repartee that is not prepared but is spontaneous, and he was at his best with this, and so it was said of Reid that he'd rather make a quip than a friend, and sometimes he would say things so cutting, so unforgettable that the object, the victim of his wit, would literally never forgive him, and that's not the way to become president. And
he didn't.
He didn't. He said that one in life said that the Republicans can do worse, and they probably will. Well, and they did.
Well, they got William McKinley in, who was his opponent for the Republican nomination, and he had difficulty even getting the support of his region in New England, isn't that right?
Yes. Well, Reid was a most reluctant and almost platonic presidential candidate. He would, in his imagination, envision himself in the White House, and it was rather pleasing. He liked that idea. But he did not like it so much that he actually chose to raise money. He was against that. He was against raising money. He was against promising favors to anyone in exchange for a commitment to his cause. He was certainly against...
Some politician. Broke the logjam, made enemies, and didn't want to make political deals.
Yeah, he was. I'm surprised he wasn't kicked out.
Miscast.
Wasn't kicked out of the Union. But he was a really pathetic presidential hopeful, and he was up against William McKinley, who, with the help of an Ohio mogul named Mark Hanna, an industrialist, shipping magnate, real estate investor, and on, steelman, I think. Mark Hanna was the first of the great businessmen, cum political strategists, cum kingmakers in modern American history. So McKinley had the ambition and the stomach for the long run that even then was required of a presidential hopeful. And he had behind him, holding his coat and passing out money, he had Mark Hanna. My guy Reid had no chance.
And he had Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. and kind of I'll hold your coat, Theodore Roosevelt.
Yeah. Roosevelt certainly was Reid's guy in 1896, but Reid disappointed him.
Let me just ask you about Reid's values, because this was a time of the rise of the labor movement. It was a time of women's suffrage. It was a time of the great wave of immigration, time of the robber barons and the big trusts. Where did Reid stand on these issues?
Women's suffrage first. He was for it. And what made his stance all the more interesting to me was that his wife Susan was against it. And there's what I take at least to be a very funny part of Reid's diary that I think is in this book. in which Reid relates, maybe it's a letter to a friend, he relates one day that he asked his wife Susan to sit down while he read to her the bill that he had drafted to put through to guarantee women the right to vote. And he read this, and as he described his wife sitting there listening to it, she was balled up on the sofa like a cat and got smaller and smaller, expressing the most adamant opposition through body language as he proceeded. The next morning, she happened to make some offhand remark critical of a certain presidential hopeful, and Reid ironically dressed her down. Don't you know that your place as a woman is not to have views on this? You're not allowed to vote, nor should you. I heard this last night, and I will not listen to you talk about things you don't know about.
Well, that was the chauvinistic thinking of the time.
Well, no, Reid was being ironic. He believed he loved women. He loved women, and he respected them, and he wanted them to take part in the intellectual and political life of the time. And patronizingly, we would call him ahead of his time. He believed he was of his time. He thought his time was one of enlightenment and progress, and he believed that it was absurd to deny women a place in the country's political life. So that was his view on female suffrage. You mentioned the robber barons. He thought this was baloney, and he delighted in mocking his Democrat adversaries with this phrase. He believed in enterprise. He believed that that monopoly in a truly free economy was impossible unless government had conferred the favors on the monopolizing company. So that was his view on, except that Reid was also a believer in the protective tariff, behind which protected and favored industries did grow up and achieve something like state endowed monopoly power. So he was a little bit muddled, I thought.
But that was the Republican position, wasn't it? There was a high tariff party.
It was indeed.
Let me ask you this: he was also a gold bug like you.
Well, he was a vacillating gold bug, unlike me.
You're a consistent gold bug.
I am. Reid was for the gold standard. I should pause a moment to tell you what this was. The gold standard was pure and simple the definition of the dollar as a weight of metal. The dollar was not what a bank could print. A bank could print a banknote promising to pay you $1, but the dollar itself was the weight of gold, and it took $20.67 by law to buy an ounce of gold. Not to buy it, but to exchange for it. That was the definition of a dollar. 1/20th plus of an ounce of gold, that was $1. The consequence of this definition was that A, the government could not just create dollars when convenient to finance its own deficit.
As it does today.
Another consequence of this constitutional definition of money as a weight of metal was that countries had to clear their deficits and surpluses with real money. They couldn't simply promise to pay later. As it were, countries operating in the gold standard operated as if they had a debit card and not as if they had a credit card. So these were some of the consequences of the gold standard. So Reid was for it. He believed also it was honorable. The government had borrowed money during the Civil War to fight this war. It promised to pay in real dollars, gold dollars. How could it now default and hold its head up as an honorable enterprise? So that was kind of the mainstream establishmentarian view at the time. But there was at the margins a kind of a clever intellectual counterpoint, which was that, well, surely the wit of man can improve upon this rather antediluvian notion that money comes out of the earth. Why don't we just print some? Wouldn't that be better?
A la Mr. Bernanke.
Yes, they didn't have the audacity of Ben S. Bernanke, PhD. They weren't quite there yet, but they did see the light. They could see what might devolve from a lot of money printed easily. Reid never got into the paper money camp, but he did at length flirt with the silver camp, which was a variation on the theme of inflation. Silver was a common metal, very cheap, and cheapening. Let's use that, some said. We'll have more dollars, the debtors will have a lighter burden of obligation, and we'll get elected because they'll like us. That was the argument against the gold standard. And Reid, when the chips were really down, 1896, began to flirt with that and his friends, including Theodore Roosevelt, just, how could he do this? How could he? And New York City was, of course, then as now, was the financial capital of the country. It was very much in the gold standard camp. People believed in the solidity and the predictability of this gold standard. And then they heard this guy they thought was their friend talking rather glibly about what they used to call bimetallism, a little bit of gold, a little bit of silver, a little bit of counterfeit. They couldn't stand it. They could say, okay, bye, next, no thanks. So
Well,
Reid lost him a little bit.
No thanks, and we have to wrap up. So I have a question for you, Jim Grant. What does the Gilded Age have to teach the digital age of today?
Well, the Gilded Age was very much like our own in that people came to think that the material progress, that amazement in everyday living was to be expected.
The amazement of everyday living was to be expected.
Yeah.
Jim Grant, thank you for coming by.
Entirely welcome, Jim.
And thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more on the digital age. For the digital age, I'm Jim Zirin. Don't forget to visit our website at www.digitalage.org. Good night and all the best.